I can't tell if this is a moment of reflection on Peter's part. Is he having a moment of self-awareness that he tends to screw up a lot, like all the time? Did he want to know if there was a screw-up threshold he shouldn't reach or he'd be out of Jesus' top 12? Or is it that the man whose foot was made for his mouth was wanting to keep track of other people's transgressions? Maybe Simon the Zealot's self-righteous enthusiasm was wearing thin. Perhaps Thomas's constant doubt about Peter catching enough fish for dinner, despite the fact that he was never there, had Peter on edge. Whatever inspired him, Peter's question exposes a very real concern for community. Does grace have a limit? Is there a community scoreboard keeping track of our missteps? And most importantly, are we allowed to sign up to track tallies against those who annoy us? Most scholars agree that the author of Matthew wrote to the newly organized community of Jesus followers, a ragamuffin group of outcasts who left all that they knew about their Jewish faith and community to start a theorized community told to them by a vagabond who was executed by the state. So clearly, the author had an easy undertaking ahead of him. The entirety of Matthew 18 is a mad dash through expectations for community living. The chapter opens with the disciples debating who is the best, only for Jesus to shush them and claim that the wiggly and giggly children are the greatest in the community of God. Their toxic masculinity dashed against the rocks as Jesus reminds them that their inflated egos and thirst for power have no place in God's community. Jesus even goes so far as to lay out explicit steps for accountability and reconciliation just verses before today's passage. Jesus seems to be pleading with his followers to see that the true community of God is built on unearned grace, a grace that isn't merit-based, a grace bestowed to us the moment we take our very first breath of life, a grace that keeps no record of wrongs nor seeks to condemn, a grace that strengthens relationships so that people feel trusted and held and seen. And when Peter's scarcity mindset still didn't get it, Jesus told today's parable. This is yet another one of those extreme tales that Jesus uses for teaching. After having just shared the explicit guidelines about community accountability, Peter's need for formulaic absolutism seems to push Jesus into a sassy rant. Thus enter our main characters. We have an enslaving ruler / payday loan shark cashing in their IOUs. We have an enslaved deity who owned 10,000 talents or 60 million denarii. A denarii a day is what the workman pays, so without inflation, that would be about 165,000 years worth of wages. And a second indebted slave who owed the first about 100 denarii, or about 3.5 months worth of wages. The juxtaposition of these debts is meant to depict the abundance of God's grace, right? That God is so gracious that our lifetime's worth of sinful debt can be forgiven if only we beg for mercy from our enslaving ruler. For the realm of heaven can be compared to a hellscape where people live merely to work off their debt to their financial overlords or be enslaved to generational debt. Well, I guess the kingdom of God really is at hand. Okay, before I take Jesus' parable too far, I want to point out that the only other time a similar debt parable appears is in Luke's gospel, when Jesus ate at a Pharisee's house named Simon. In Luke's account, a woman sacrifices expensive perfume to wash and anoint Jesus' feet. While Simon scoffs at Jesus for letting the scarlet-lettered woman touch him, Jesus decides to invite his Pharisaic host into the moment by telling a story. A certain moneylender had 2 debtors, one who owed 500 denarii, the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debts for both. Now, Jesus asks, Which of them will he be more loved by? And Simon answered, I suppose the one whom he canceled the greater debt. And Jesus told him, you have judged correctly. In both stories, we are exposed to a grace value system that would make any accountant squirm. The economics don't make sense, and that's the point. Jesus meets Peter's original tally marks question and Simon's judgmental condemnation with the reminder that the economics of forgiveness and grace are illogical. In the community of God, grace is given freely to everyone. The eradication of debts, regardless of who you are or where you came from, meets you at the door. But there is a catch. In Matthew's story, the liberation of the first enslaved person doesn't end with a celebration of his family's Independence Day, like most of us would think. Jesus quickly shifts from the inconceivable grace of the ruler and exposes the fallacy of Peter's original question. Peter wanted to keep the ledger of wrongs, oblivious to his own miraculous liberation, ignorant to his own hypocrisy, ready to call out sinners just like the Pharisees do to him every day, ready to shackle those beneath him just like the newly liberated deadee. As the parable comes to its vindictive conclusion, it's like Jesus saw Peter opening his mouth with another hypothetical what if, and so the sassy son of Mary slaps the best wait until my father hears about this shutdown possible. He doesn't leave the accountability within grace unacknowledged. If you do not forgive your siblings from your heart, my heavenly daddy will bring your debts against you. Yikes. Jesus used a hyperbolic and sassy story to shut down Peter's judgmental side, to remind him where he came from, to help him remember his own humanity and the humanity of the people that he sought to judge. The author of Matthew's Gospel uses this story to remind that once outcast group of ragamuffins, as well as ourselves, that condemnation and the implicit power dynamics at place when one thinks they have the upper hand to judge have no place in the community of God. I'm also grateful for Luke's version of this story. You see, in Luke's narrative, the focus wasn't really about the debts. It wasn't even really about the extravagant forgiveness. It's about what we do when we are forgiven. Then, turning toward the woman who had anointed his feet, Jesus said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, hence she has shown great love." When we confess to be in the community of God, we must live into a grace that compels us all to show up as our fully messy selves. For those of us whose inner critic comes out with a tally system against others or self, this grace is a reminder to calm down. All of us carry the weight of trying to survive this thing called life, and most of the time, we don't get it right. For Peter, grace came in the form of a snarky humility check. For Simon, grace came to him when he really saw the woman. Not when he looked down at her for the ways in which he thought he was better, but when he saw how the woman's gratitude moved her to service, humility, and joy. If we confess to be in the community of God, we commit to hold grace and space for folks to show up, to mess up, to reconcile with accountability, and to try again. Rather than rush out to accost the first person who has done us wrong, we remember our own moments of receiving grace, the moments where our shame and mistakes were met with compassion. where edification is done not for the sake of ego or self-righteousness, but as a non-judgmental act of loving kindness for the whole person as a beloved member of God's community. I think this is why Jesus taught his disciples to partake in communion whenever they gathered. Meals have a powerful way of reminding everyone that we have more in common, the good, the bad, and the ugly, than we care to admit. While Jonathan leads us in our next hymn, I invite you to suspend your own judgment of who is deserving. And instead, I invite you to remember the moments where grace and compassion met you when you thought you didn't deserve it. I invite you to remember how it felt to have a loving hand pull you from the depths of your despair and fill you with the good things like love and understanding and kindness. Before we gather around this table, I invite you to reflect and remember the way that love has met you with no strings attached. Do you recall the way gratitude ripples out from you when you are most felt as seen and cared for? May this time be used to help you connect with that.